Hello, I want to talk about retail and fast food workers for a sec, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about class struggle. As someone once said in 1848, the history of all existing society is the history of class struggle. And that's still true today. We see conflict between classes in many different ways, and some of them are more visible and obvious than others. For example, the organisation of big retail bosses, the Australian Retailers Association, publicly backed by Coles, Woolworths, Costco, Kmart, and many others, i.e., the organisations responsible for our cost of living crisis, have launched a campaign in the Bosses' Court to cut penalty rates and break entitlements for some of Australia's lowest paid workers. We should never have let it get to this stage, but that's where we are now, and we should be outraged. An attack like this affects every worker. In an economy based on competition, lowering the standard for what's acceptable in one industry has ramifications for all of us. The ARA shockingly states that their application to cut penalty rates and reduce break time is about empowering employees to understand their rights and creating a more flexible modern system that better balances the needs of both workers and employers. What a load of rubbish. Understanding you're not getting paid penalty rates is an empowerment. Flexibility just means it's easier for the bosses to bend the rules and fuck us over at work. The fact of the matter is that our interests as workers are fundamentally opposed to the bosses. There isn't a framework where bosses and workers' interests are aligned. Ultimately, they want to pay us less and work us more because it's our labour that creates their wealth, and the less we have, the more they do, and vice versa. They know that this is true, which is why they're banding together to attack all of us. As socialists, we're not neutral in this question. We know that there's a class war going on and we pick the side of the working class. We know that the bosses have their cause, which recently found in favour of Woolworths against warehouse workers, demonstrating that the state isn't neutral, but is an instrument of class war for the bosses. They have their industry associations like the ARA, and they have their political parties like the Liberals and ultimately even the ALP. We can see where their donations go. Unfortunately, some of the institutions that we actually do have, like unions, have in recent times pursued a strategy of class collaboration instead of class combat. Class collaboration is where unions cooperate with the boss instead of fighting the boss. It's where class peace is the goal between two fundamentally opposed classes. This is not only impossible to achieve, but it's also an inevitable failure. And ultimately, what it has resulted in is the bosses going on a warpath unopposed. A historical example of this kind of class collaboration stuff is where unions would agree to have no strike clauses as long as they were assured indexed regular wage rises. The unions would naturally keep their promise, and then the greed of capital means that the bosses wouldn't keep theirs. There is no better example of class collaboration in a union than the SDA. This is a union that historically refuses to go on strike and that was found to have EBAs worse off than the award. The SDA consistently gets in bed with bosses to fuck over workers under the pretense of improving things for everyone. This just doesn't work. That's not how society works. There exists an irreconcilable class division that cannot be resolved through negotiation. Not only does the SDA engage in class collaboration against the interests of its own members, ensuring that they're worse off under their own EBAs compared to the general award, for example, it occasionally advocates explicitly for things that are against the interests of the broader working class. The SDA in 2007 made a submission to the Victorian Law Reform Commission Abortion Law Inquiry, stating that there is not and can never be a right to have an abortion, further stating that it should remain a serious criminal offence under Victorian law. In 2012, the SDA made a submission to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee in relation to the same-sex marriage bill, where they state, the SDA has a long-standing policy in support of marriage being a union between a man and a woman. They were effectively opposing same-sex marriage. They also said some pretty outrageous stuff about children being better served in terms of their morality based on the sex of their parents, which is incredibly outdated. But moving on from this other outrageous stuff, the SDA's class collaboration approach has resulted in what we're seeing today. By being friendly with the bosses have the courage to propose that they shouldn't have to pay penalty rates for workers earning more than $67,000 a year. By refusing to strike, the SDA has effectively given the bosses the ability to propose that workers should be back on split shifts and reduce the minimum break between shifts on different days. That's a pretty big safety issue. In order to fight this, we need fighting unions. unions that truly represent working class interests to push back against these attacks. We can't have a situation where, in response to these massive attacks on pay and conditions, we get press conferences, statements, and legal challenges to bosses' courts. We won't ever win in those courts what we can't win on the shop floor. We need fighting unions, and we need workers to join unions that strike, and workers who join unions to push them to strike. We know that the most powerful and effective tool that we have against capital is withdrawing our labour. So why not join a union that knows this and encourages this? In 2023, RAFWU, the Retail and Fast Food Workers Union, organised a super strike in Coles and Woolworths retail stores for the first time in history. We need that and more to send a message to the bosses, their mates in the courts, and their cronies in Parliament that we won't roll over anymore. In order to do that, we need to fight and we need to join fighting unions. So if you're a retail or fast food worker, join RAFWU. If you're not a retail and fast food worker, join your union wherever you are. Our struggles are not separate struggles. An attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. So we need to join in and fight back because we know that the SDA definitely isn't going to be the one to do it. Plus, it's always nice to see a boss getting fucked. Love you all.